All right, thank you, Ross. I'll turn myself on. There we go. Okay, you can adjust the sound accordingly. Well, this is probably my favorite group to come to in the whole world. It's like you are the most enthusiastic, supportive group of creation supporters that I go to. And I speak about 200 times this year to probably about 80 different groups, 5 overseas missions trips running 2 to 3 weeks at a time. And by the way, the speaker in February, Julie Von Vet and Vince, they've joined me on a lot, or if not most, of these missions trips. My wife, Robin, she's joined me on all the missions trips. And we're going to start off talking kind of about an update of, I just got back 3 days ago from 2 weeks in the Philippines, and I want to give you an update because the Twin Cities Creation Science Association is a huge part of what you're about to see. Nothing that I'm going to talk about for the first 10 minutes could be happening if it wasn't for folks like you taking part of it. Now, my background, just a little bit, because I know many of you know me, some of you I know don't. I see a lot of new faces, because it's been 2 years since I've been here. This is my 6th time to come speak in the Twin Cities, probably over the last decade. And you support what's going on overseas. And for 30 years, coming out of college as pretty agnostic, everything could be explained without God, the product of an American education system. God was irrelevant because I love science, and science explained it all. I came to know the Lord, realized there's a whole bunch of things I hadn't been told, and it became my passion in life to share the trustworthiness of God's Word as absolute reality, history, and truth in the area of science and other places. And I've been doing that for 30 years. And I've been speaking to creation groups. And there's kind of this unstated idea that if we could just get the evidence for creation in front of a whole generation, in their education, in their thoughts, in their thinking, it would have an enormous impact on the future and the direction the entire country would go. But we're locked out of the education system in America. We've got to go around it. And that's the purpose of a lot of the resources you'll hear about, is to get the truth in front of people, because teachers, school boards, they know they're likely to be sued if they bring any speaker in that would even hint at biblical creation, even intelligent design. Well, I was on a missions trip about 3 years ago. I was invited to come to Fiji, and I suggested to the missionary, if we printed one of our creation devotionals where every day of the year there's a topic on biology or geology or astronomy or genetics or physics, and then it ties to the Bible at the bottom with a Bible verse, and we could print a bunch of copies, give them to the students in the public schools, and do a science assembly, do you think we could get into the public schools? Well, that was beyond my wildest dreams what happened. I mean, ultimately, we were approved by the National Department of Education for the entire nation of Fiji over a 3-year period to go to every single public high school in the whole nation. We got funding through you and miraculously others to print ultimately 250,000 gorgeous hardcover books, full color, to give out to these students. About half of them are used in Fiji. The others are being now distributed in the Philippines, Vanuatu, next year the Cook Islands, and other nations where they teach in English in their education system. Now, Julie's filled in over various weeks, kind of updates what's happened as we went through Fiji. This year, for the first time, we thought, let's go to another nation and see if the impact's the same. So I want to share a few pictures. In February, we took a missions team, 8 people, broke into 2 groups. I designed a presentation, and you'll see just a little piece of it as part of this presentation today, to go and present what does science show us about where we came from. And then we went back again the last 2.5 weeks in Philippines a second time with another team from another church. And this time we took 16 people, so we had 2 teams of 8 people. The second speaker that's coming, by the way, in March, Jay Seegert, he's been part of this. He's been on these teams to go over to Fiji. Spike Pasaris, probably one of the top astronomy creation teachers in the world, has caught the vision, and he was with me in the Philippines the last 2 weeks to go into these schools. But here's what these schools look like. This is Spike with part of his team. This is a typical school we've just got done speaking at. What they are holding up, all of them have just received a copy of this book. And they are unbelievably excited that they would get a book. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. Now, we have spoken in just the Philippines, 49 high schools during these 2 trips. 5 universities are among those 49 high schools, so it's actually 44 and 5. We've given 71 presentations overall. Also spoke to churches and a pastors' conference where I was able to bring the evidence for creation to 300 pastors gathered from Thailand and Indonesia and the Philippines and Japan and all over Southeastern Asia, all for a 2-day conference. And they heard 4 hours of that, why the Bible's trustworthy with creation. Here's was my team. 31,000 students have received this book so far in the Philippines. This is another assembly. As we go in and talk, okay, we're bringing science into their schools. I'm a research leader with 28 years experience. I'm an inventor with 17 patented inventions for Dow Chemical and an author of 7 books. So very credible speakers coming to speak on science. We show them how science works, that it's just a tool. It can't determine truth. It's just a tool to try to figure out what is the truth. That the Bible is not just a book of religion. It's the very first thing we show them. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. You know, science is about the study of time, space, energy, matter. In the beginning is time. Created is energy. The heavens is literally everything above the earth. Space and the earth is matter. Time, space, energy, and matter is the very first verse of the Bible. We help them understand it's not just a religious statement. The laws of science point to creation. The complexity of life shows it could never create itself. And every experiment ever done confirms that. So we know the truth. You show them that apes could never become people genetically. We're going to end today's talk showing you the statements of John Sanford, one of the world's top geneticists. The rocks and the fossils are the result of a worldwide flood. And then why do their textbooks filled with it? Why is the internet and the movies filled with this idea of evolution? We pack all that into an hour, and then we give them a book. And by the way, here's me talking about the complexity of life. We end every single presentation with the gospel message. Yeah, here's the evidence you have a creator, but that creator is also your savior. And the book ends with how can you come back into fellowship with that savior? How can you live forever with him? So all of that to every single public school student. And the response is just unbelievable. I mean, the students are enjoying it. They're listening. Here's their faces. They're packed in as we fill, school after school. Here's a Muslim student reading her book. Can't wait to dig into the book and start reading it. And I love this picture because it happens over and over again. This young man came up after the crowd had dispersed, came up to our van, and we rolled the window down. And he looked at us with great sincerity, and he said, because they didn't get it, he said, you mean I get to keep this book? Because all their books, they have to give them back. They don't even own books. It's mine? Kind of reminds you of a little Harry Potter from the Philippines, doesn't it? And he just could not believe he would get a book. They're going to be read over and over and shared with friends and family. And one last thing, just so you understand the impact, okay? Here's the kids right after they get their books. I want you to look at these faces. They're just packed into these, hanging off of the balconies, listening to what we have to say. Now, here's these kids listening intently. I got this letter after the first missions trip to the Philippines. He said, your ministry came to our university yesterday. This was one of the university students. I'm one of the students who listened and was given your book, Explore the World, and I want to express my gratitude for coming to our school and giving away these books. The book is amazing. Reading even a page strengthened my faith. It really did. I don't know how to even explain my feelings right now because I was so amazed by your book. You see, I love science, and your book is about both science and the Bible. To be honest, I was losing my faith ever since grade 9. When I was in junior high, we learned about religions of different countries. And by the way, the Philippines is like 90% Catholic, but it's just a work your way to heaven, very, very superficial faith, okay? But it's just very predominant. So he knows about God. But I learned about comparing religions. It had a great impact on me. I started to question, does God even exist? What if the pagans are true? What if Buddhism or Hinduism or Islam is true? How do I know which one's true? I was really confused. Then along comes science explaining the evolution of humanity. Again, I was confused. What if science is true? What if we came from apes? What if the Big Bang is true? There are all these questions bothering my mind year after year. Then your ministry came. It literally changed my life. This book has changed my life. It's the best book I've ever read. Last night I stayed up late reading and crying and praying to the Lord, asking Him to forgive me for doubting Him. I was thanking Him for letting you come to our university. I've asked God to bless you and change more people. My mom believes you're literally a messenger from God. I can't express my gratitude enough. I can't believe how many years I've been confused, and now I'm enlightened. Every page makes me love my Creator more. God bless you. Continue your work. You are all part of that work. See, none of this could happen unless people were donating. See, we have an open door to the nations of the world. They're like 2 generations behind America. They're not hardened to the idea that the Bible could be true. They're looking for why is it true, but they're not hearing it. And then we can show up and show them how it all fits together, like nothing I've ever seen in my lifetime. So thank you for being part of it. It's like God's moving in this amazing way. And we're just going to continue to get out there and get books to these people. Now, what we're going to talk about tonight, the main part of the lecture, tonight's just this celebration of God and what He's done. Starting with what He's done there on the foreign missions field. Every single missionary we've worked with, they are just over the top excited at the access science assemblies and giving these kids books has given them into these schools to reach out and interact with these students. They can't just walk into a school and talk about the gospel. But we can show them how science supports their belief in God and end it with the gospel and allow them for follow-up. So we're going to talk tonight about incredible designs and discoveries that have totally changed humanity because we've looked at both what God has done and how things operate that we never would have known, I think, had we not looked at what God did first. Now I want to start here. The very first command of God, after He said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, and that ancient King James word replenish literally means fill the earth. He said, subdue, have dominion over it, the fish, the birds, everything that lives. That word, dominion, you go into a ancient Bible, thesaurus, it literally means to control it, to understand it, to use it. That is what science does, to control and understand creation. So God told us to do that, but why? That's my question. Why did God do that? Because God knew before creation everything that was going to happen. Time is part of the physical creation of the universe. Everything we now know about science says time varies with mass and acceleration and so on. It's part of creation. God is not locked inside of time. So He has to know everything that's ever going to happen in the past and the future. This just opened my understanding of what Jesus did on the cross. See, as fully man and fully God, when He died on the cross, He is God. He's outside of time. He is literally, at that moment, dying for every single one of us who will live in the future, because he's God. He's outside of time. He knows what's going to happen. That's such a concept. So why, when he looks at what human beings do, they start worshiping creation, they misuse creation, they hoard creation, they use it to harm other people, they pollute it, they waste it. Why would he give us charge over creation? Why would he do that? Because he knew we were going to do all those things as human beings. Well, there's two reasons. The first one is found in Romans. God said, that which be known of him is obvious to everybody. The them here is every human being. God has shown it to them, for the invisible things of God have been known from the creation of the world, being understood by what has been made. By looking at creation, we will know he exists. That's a big part of why every single human being is without excuse for belief and therefore for obeying God. It's why he's just when he brings judgment upon all human beings who have rebelled against him, because we all know by just looking at creation. That's part of, and it's by taking dominion, by studying it, we will know it couldn't have made itself. It's a whole nother lecture. But the second reason is just God's lavish love for us. This is a verse from Job. He says, ask the beasts, they will teach you. The birds of the heaven, they will tell you. It's because we can learn so much that I don't think we would have learned any other way by looking at what he's made. And that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to do this celebration of what we've learned from what God has made. Now I'm going to start, I'm going to back up just a second. Back up. Don't look at that yet. Okay, I'm going to start with just a fun little creature, okay? Little 1-minute video. David Edinburgh, the evolutionist from England, and with his English accents narrating. So he just believes this fish made itself and came from bacteria that turned into more complicated stuff that eventually turned into fish that did what this fish is about to do. Now I want you to just watch what this fish is capable of. It's called the Japanese puffer fish, and it just is so cool. So just enjoy. I think God does these things for our amazement and for our enjoyment. Watch what this fish is capable of.
This small Japanese pufferfish is dull, almost to the point of invisibility. But to compensate, he is probably nature's greatest artist. To grab a female's attention, he creates something that almost defies belief. His only tools are his fins. In his head, a plan of mathematical perfection. He ploughs the sand, breaking it up into the finest of particles. These shells aren't just rubbish to be removed. He uses them to decorate the ridges of his construction. He can't rest for more than a moment, but must work 24 hours a day for a week, or the current will destroy his creation. A final tidy up, and his masterpiece is complete. Nowhere else in nature does an animal construct something as complex and perfect as this. If this doesn't get him noticed, nothing will.
Now that little fish is about 6 inches long. If he was as tall as us, he is creating a perfect circle as wide as from that wall to that wall, perfectly circular. He never swims up above it to look down. He's just shoving stuff around with his fins and his head. No human being could do that, what this little fish does. And how do they explain it? He's trying to attract a babe. He's making this gorgeous sculpture because he's trying to attract his babe to come lay eggs there. Now that's a story. That's not science. It's just a story to try to ignore the genius and the beauty that God has built into the DNA instincts of animals. See, they did a test a while back where for decades, if not 100 years, they tried to explain how beautiful peacocks are. You know, all those beautiful feathers on a male peacock, because the more beautiful it is, the better it can attract a female. So what did they do? A while back, they went and they cut all the beautiful feathers off the peacock so he was pug ugly. Then they sent him in with a whole bunch of beautiful peacocks, and they decided, let's see which one the females will be attracted to. Didn't make an iota of difference. Had nothing to do with the beauty. Beauty is there as a signpost that says, I am a creative God who creates beauty. Look at that. Now we have this gorgeous, perfect wheel under the ground. We're going to start by talking about transportation, and I know what you're thinking. I'm going to try to convince you that somebody way back in the Stone Age saw this thing and created the wheel. Well, not quite. Whoops, what's just happened there? Ah! Boy, I am having issues. Now, all of these ancient, Gary Larson cartoons, they always portray ancient man as these absolute idiots. The whole idea of the Stone Age is to squeeze evolution into our thinking. Now, there were people eking out a living after the flood of Noah, living in really harsh environments, trying to find shelter in caves. Cro-Magnon, Neanderthal, people living in Europe. And without a doubt, there are cultures that have degenerated downwards. But at the same time, there were the Egyptians and the Incas and the Chinese and the people in India with absolutely brilliant advanced civilizations at the same time of Earth history. So this whole idea that we came from Stone Age ignorant people it's just cartoons. And this is my favorite. Here's the invention of the wheel. Not quite working well, is it? Here's the next one. Where did the wheel come from? Thag becomes the first fatality of falling asleep at the wheel. And here comes the saber-toothed tiger. It's just that portrayal. Now, the first absolutely world-changing invention I'm going to talk about is not the transportation by carts and horses and automobiles. It's flight. Imagine the world without flight. That is this earth for 5,800 years of human history from the time of creation of Adam and Eve, and that's what the Bible would say if you take it in a straightforward way to mean what it says. Right up until 1903, no flight. But we dreamed of flight. You see, we invented movies in the 1880s. We were taking tin-type photographs during the Civil War in the 1850s and 60s, strung them together in movies in the 1880s, and people started filming mankind's attempt at flight. Now, I think people have always dreamed they could fly. And I use this part of the presentation when I go in these public schools, and we talk about all the different things you try to do as you were dreaming you could fly, and making paper airplanes, all this stuff. Watch mankind's early attempts at flight. This is the best we could do. Now, he survived. That's the same pilot climbing back out. All right. So there's our early attempts. Now, what were they trying to do? How? Imitate a bird, imitate a wing. See, we understood there's something special about those wings. But it wasn't, and they even understood that somehow we got to get those wings moving. But it wasn't until we understood the principles behind it, that air moving across that foil shape moves at different speeds, top and bottom, creates low and high pressure and allows lift to happen. And it was the Wright brothers. Their father was a minister, a Presbyterian minister. They were strong Christian believers looking at creation, realizing that had to be the key. They realized you got to get that shape moving fast enough. So they flew, it was just Orville, climbed onto that plane at Kitty Hawk in South Carolina, or North Carolina, flew for about 18 seconds in a straight line. They then went, grabbed a bunch of reporters, got a film crew, came back within the next few days, and when they filmed this classic film of mankind's very first flight. Now you'll notice both Orville and Wilbur climb onto the plane this time, and they lift this huge weight up a tower, and it's the weight dropping down that propels the plane forward fast enough to get it in the air, like an airplane on an aircraft carrier. I didn't realize that. Without that, they couldn't have got it moving fast enough, but they realized that had to be the key. Watch this early picture of mankind's flying for the very first time. There goes the weight, and there they go. Now look at these reporters. They are so astounded. They drop to their knees. They can't believe what they're seeing. Nothing like this has ever been seen before. That was only 116 years ago. That's so short of a period of time. Unbelievable. And why? Why did we learn it? Because we looked at what God had designed and we put the principles to work. You know, they're having fun. They're banking and soaring. It's like God has given us this enormous sandbox called creation to play in. And we're like little kindergarten children compared to Him, not even that. And He says, enjoy it, learn from it, benefit from it, because I've made it for your use. I command you to take dominion over it and understand it and control it, because He knows the benefits it will bring. But it's not just that we learn to fly. You see, the early birds, or the early planes, they all had wings that were straight out. As we got planes that were faster and faster, we needed to make them more maneuverable. So what are we going to do? We're going to look at the fastest birds out there. And there's the bird called the swift for a reason. It's the fastest bird on level flight. It can fly 104 miles per hour, like you're standing still. Well, you usually are on the interstates around Minneapolis. But if you're moving, it's like you're standing still. It will fly for up to 10 months without ever landing. Now think about this. It doesn't land. It wants to fly. In its lifetime, they've clocked it, and they think the equivalent of 1.5 million miles. That's like 8 times all the way to the moon and back and around. It's a long way, or 100 times around the earth. It drinks while it's flying. I've seen them do this. They will swoop down, take a drink, and keep moving without ever stopping. They'll just open their mouth a little bit. Love this one. It sleeps while flying. We tell the kids at the high school, Don't you wish you could do this in math class? It shuts down one eye and half of its brain, and then it'll shut down the other eye and the other half of its brain so it can rest. It makes babies while flying. The only time it stops is to build the nest and lay the eggs. It loves to fly. So what bird are we going to look at to think, how can we make it faster, more maneuverable? I mean, straight out were the wings on the Wright brothers plane, the World War I biplanes, the World War II planes, the early airliners. Look at how we build airliners today. All of the wings are swept back because of the design of the birds. And then you get a problem. You have planes moving really fast that are really heavy. And the most dangerous part of flight is when you come in for a landing. If you slow down, you lose lift, which means you start fluttering like a leaf. Most crashes are because of stalling during landing. So we started looking at big birds. What do they do? What do these big birds do when they come down? They deploy two little feathers on the forward part of their wing. Here's an eagle coming in. Here's a Canadian goose coming in, bringing out these two feathers. Why in the world are they doing that? Airplane designers figured it out. It increases the airfoil, increases the amount of lift. You don't want them out there when you're trying to move fast, but once you're landing and slowing down, and every modern airplane has forward flaps on the wings because the birds did it first. That's where we got the idea. Boy, why is it doing that? Okay, back up. Back up. Wow, okay. I was in the woods probably 10 years ago, walking late in the evening, and just kind of walking along, strolling along, and like this enormous creature came right past my head, scared the living daylights out of me because I did not hear a whisper of a sound. It's just suddenly there. It was a barn owl, wingspan about 6 feet, huge bird, making no sound. They're like the stealth bombers of the forest world at night. Huge eyes, and they'll just come down and grab those rodents, and they don't even hear they're coming. Well, what did that lead to? Turns out all these early computers, anybody had a Commodore 64 way back, dating you, they were really loud. I still like really loud fans to cool all those inefficient electronics. Well, the fans are still kind of loud. What they've discovered is these wings have these little notches and frills and soft little ends on the feathers, and it allows the air to move by them without creating turbulence. And it's turbulence of moving air that creates a lot of that noise, and it allows them to fly really, really quiet. So we've started to design computer fans with all these notches, and they're much, much quieter. Directly attributed to the design of the bird. How can it move through air quietly? How can we make fans that move air quietly? Because of what God did first. I keep coming back to that. God did it first, allowed us to discover it. And what we're talking about throughout this lecture is a thing called biomimicry. Mimicry is to copy, bio is to copy something biological. In most engineering colleges and medical colleges, they have, if not just classes, but whole specialties in biomimicry. But here's the tragedy. None of these students ever, even once, will get to hear there's a creator, there's a God behind these designs. It's all attributed to evolution or adaptation. We're going to talk about that at the very end, because we as Christians are to be the light and the truth and not hide it under a basket, but to put it on a hill and to put it in front of people. It's how we're going to make an impact with the next generation, but not if we don't talk about these things. How do we know that they're wrong? That's probably the most important part of this lecture. How do we know that a little change, little random changes from one animal to another, little random mutations might have a useful function, couldn't change one animal into another? And we can know that that couldn't possibly be true. At the very end, I'll talk about that. Now, fun part of this lecture is you get to participate. Major technological developments that change the course of human history. This is one of them. Now, some of you have had my Rocks Crowd series, and one of the lectures is this lecture, a shorter version of it. So if you know the answer, just kind of hold off. Let's see if anybody can get a guess. Anybody know what major technological development this Osage orange led to? It's a tree, and that's what the fruit looks like. It inspired an invention clear back in 1868 to a man named Michael Kelly. He used this tree to invent something that changed the course of American history. Any ideas? Any guesses? If you don't already know for sure. Baseball, I love it. And we always come back to sports, man. I hear golf. No, it's too big to be a golf ball. Baseball, basketball, it's about the size of a basketball almost. Nope, none of the above, has nothing to do with sports, but good guess. Good guess. They're pretty hard, and you can throw them. Hit them with a bat, and you end up with green stuff all over your face. Okay, it sells 200 million pounds of it a year to this day. And, I mean, if you put it end to end, it would be 1,000,000 miles long. The circumference there is about 25,000. What's that? Bubble gum. Bubble gum. Another good guess. Now, that's a new one. Very original. Nope. I think like bubble gum comes from the gum tree. This is an Osage orange tree. Let me give you a little more information. Back in the early 1800s, Thomas Jefferson was the president, and he did the Louisiana Purchase, the land bargain of the millennium. Doubled the size of the United States of America. France was in a war, sold off all that land that they had. And as a result, it caused an enormous westward expansion. Land grants were being given, people were moving out west, and over the next few decades, they had all these big port cities, St. Louis, Chicago, like quadrupled, 10 times the number of people were living there, and they had to feed all these people. They're not growing gardens when they're living in these big cities. We're an agricultural society. You got to feed all these people that are now living in cities, supplying the people that are moving out west. One of the most efficient food sources of that day were cattle. Chickens, a chicken won't feed a family for very long, but a cow will feed a family for a long time. Lots of slaughterhouses, but you got to contain the cows. And the Great Plains don't have very many trees. So what the farmers would do, they would plant rows of Osage orange trees because these suckers had spikes on them, and cows don't like pushing through those kind of things any more than people would like pushing through them. So they made really efficient fences, and they could fence in their land. Trouble is, it would take 10 years to grow a hedge to contain a field. Well, Michael Kelly looked at that and thought, you know what I'm talking, you know where I'm heading now? Barbed wire. I was researching this, I found a book and it said the West wasn't tamed by the Colt 45, the West was won by barbed wire because it allowed us to feed a nation. If I could just put little barbs on a wire and string it between posts, oh, why is it doing that? Okay, just a second. Back we go. You know, look at the similarity. You use a barbed wire, there's the Osage orange branch. Very, very similar. I'm going to go to try just hit this. Now, unfortunately, you probably saw a head to the wasp nest. I mean, I brought one. It's kind of cool. They get pretty big. Lots and lots of very thin sheets of essentially a paper-like material. Now, actually invented by René Antoine Renoir, a Frenchman, in 1719. At that time, books were made out of linen, ground up fibers of material which were pressed to form books and then sewn together with leather covers. So books were incredibly expensive, incredibly rare. There was no motivation for people to learn to read. But he invented it because he went walking through the woods. I don't know if he was stung or just fascinated by a big wasp nest. He started to pull off these sheets, and he thought, this is really thin paper. This is paper. It's like linen. If it was pressed flat, you could write on it. If this little stinging insect can make this, why can't we make it? So he spent years trying to figure out, how do we make paper? Now, the Chinese and the Japanese were making it 2,000 years earlier, but they never turned it into a manufacturing process. They just did it very inefficiently. He figured out how to do it as a manufacturing process to make very cheap paper. Now, I want you to imagine the world without paper. I mean, we would have no photographs, no way to have photographs or print them. We would have no newspapers. Well, I guess nobody has newspapers anymore. But then, you know, how would you know that you could get a deep dish Domino's pizza with a Detroit-style mozzarella cheese, one topping for only $11.99 if we didn't have paper? How would we know that? You wouldn't be able to have manuals to learn about how to even use computers. You know, you wouldn't be able to have fun things like origami and paper airplanes. All sorts of cool, fun stuff. Books would not be cheap. There'd be no motivation to teach the populace. How could you send out our newsletters? I mean, here's the Twin Cities Creation Society newsletter. Comes in an envelope, stapled together. All sorts of mail, an entire industry is created. Money becomes cheap instead of heavy. Paper towels, you know, and about Amazon. We'd still be sending stuff around in barrels. You have to have some pretty big drones to stuff your stuff around in barrels. And then there's the biggie, you know, what about toilet paper? You know, what's the world going to be like without our toilet paper? We'd still be using leaves. Paper changed the world in amazing ways because of a wasp. That was the key. God did it first, figured out how to dissolve that cellulose and recast it and turn it into paper. Amazing, amazing thing. All right, another invention changed the world. This one was invented by Joseph Buford Cox, once again during his lunch break in the woods, 1946, a little bit more recent history. He's sitting there eating his lunch on a stump, and he notices the larva of something called a timber beetle just chomping its way through the wood fibers of that stump. And he looks at it, and he's thinking, wow, it's really chomping away at these wood fibers very efficiently. Now, he'd been out there all morning sweating like crazy with his crosscut saw, cutting through the woods. Now, these crosscut saw have just little pointed teeth that are offset up and down a little bit, and you have two men, and they're pretty fast, but it takes 2 men to go back and forth and back and forth. And even when they had chainsaws, the chains were made with just little pointed teeth, just like the crosscut saw. He looked at this beetle, and he noticed its mandible had two little curved hooks that would slide past each other, like a pair of scissors, in a curved way. And he thought, what if I put on a chain these little curved teeth instead of little pointed teeth? And he invented the chainsaw blade. Started the Oregon Chainsaw Company, to this day one of the major chainsaw makers in the world, and it revolutionized our ability to harvest wood. It really drove an entire timber industry, which is now replants for us in order to reharvest them. Now, this one I love. What are the smallest bones in the human body? I see you pointing to it, and a lot of you understand that. The hammer, the anvil, and the stirrup, they're called that because they look that way in our ear. It was those bones that, again, changed all of human history. The course of humanity was changed by looking at these bones and understanding how they operated. This is what came of it. And I should have left the name off because you immediately know what the invention is. But this, I never realized this. This is a quote from Alexander Graham Bell. He said, "It occurred to me that if a membrane as thin as toilet paper, tissue paper, incredibly thin membrane, that's our eardrum, could control the vibrations of bones that were immense in size and weight compared to that tissue paper. You know, those three little bones weigh 1,000 times more than that little thin membrane. And yet it's the vibration of the membrane. If they vibrate the distance of the thickness of an atom, it's transferred to those bones that transfer it to a fluid, that move the fluid, that move hairs, that cause a signal that is interpreted in the brain as sound. But it's the membrane moving the bones, okay, that causes it all to happen. Why shouldn't a large, thick membrane be able to vibrate iron, which weighs a lot more than the membrane, in front of an electromagnet? Because when you move iron in front of an electromagnet, it sends an electric current through a wire that can be picked up at the other end, cause iron on that end to vibrate another membrane that will produce sound. So you can make sound be turned into electrical oscillating signal that at the other end of the wire can turn that oscillating signal back into sound. What have I just described? A microphone and a speaker. That's what a telephone is. You have to have a microphone, make an electric signal that will turn it into sound again. You understand, Alexander Graham Bell was not an electrician, an electrical engineer, a classic scientist. Alexander Graham Bell was a pathologist. And he had a deaf mother and a deaf wife, and he wanted to know, how does the ear work? And when he realized how it worked, he realized, I could do the same thing on a more massive scale. And the world has changed. Little trivia. Anybody know what the first message transmitted over a wire was? I love it when I get that response, because you have had history class. Young people, they don't even get to hear these things anymore. But you know what? That was a trick question. That was the first message that came from over a telephone. Watson, come here. But it wasn't the first message transmitted over a wire. That was the Morse code. The first message transmitted over a wire, let me back up, is what has God wrought? The very first signal moving through a wire and showing up in another spot using the telegraph. What has God wrought means what has God made? What has God made allows us to make things. What a perfect first message. And then Alexander Graham Bell was Watson, come here. Not quite as significant, but I love that. All right. Useful inventions, not quite as significant, but this one was invented by George de Maistreau in 1941 during a walk in the woods. Hey, you know, I'm getting the feeling going for a walk in the woods might be a really good thing in life. Look at all the inventions that have come from that. Now, George was walking in the woods one day, and the idea he got took him 14 years to perfect. He saw something that bugged him and intrigued him, and he spent the next 14 years of his life working on this invention. It resulted in $1 billion industry that to this day employs over 2,500 people. Anybody guess? Ah, you saw ahead. And I was going to give you some clues by bouncing my basketball and then throwing it up there. Velcro. It's used by the astronauts and the space stations and the space shuttles because nothing is easier to stick things together. Every pair of kids' shoes. And how did he notice? He got all these little cockaburrs, all these seed pods stuck to himself and his dog as he was going for this walk. And he thought, why do they stick so well? And he studied and he noticed they had these little hooks, and fabric has little hairs sticking out, and the two will stick together. And that's exactly what it looks like when you blow up Velcro. Just exactly like that little cockaburr. Again, an exact replica. God did it first. $1 billion industry. Now, just again, fun inventions that are really kind of significant in what they've turned into. What can we learn from a dog's paw? Well, in this case, the inventor was Paul Sperry. It goes back to 1935. All through the 1700s, 1800s, you know, up into the 1900s, almost all shoes were made of leather and the bottoms were flat. And in general, the idea is you want to have a large surface area. The more the surface area, the more friction, the better the shoe's going to hold. Well, Paul loved to sail, and he's out there on his sailing boat, and he notices when the deck gets wet, he slips really easily, but his dog's just running around back and forth on the deck and never seems to slip or fall. His Cocker Spaniel looks at the bottom of his dog's feet and he's thinking, well, essentially he's got leather pads, just leather on the bottom of his feet. Why is he able to have so much more traction than me? There's not near as much surface area on this dog's foot. But then he realizes, and unfortunately I can't use my pointer very well on a screen because it just bounces off, but there's essentially a bunch of V-shaped grooves. If you go up and down and up and down and up and down, you've got V grooves. And he was thinking, well, maybe that channels the water out away from the foot. And he went on to invent the deck shoe with a herringbone pattern. patented it. To this day, tennis shoes have varying forms of this sort of thing. Automobile tires, varying forms of a V-shaped pattern that allow water to be channeled out because God did it first. That's the inception of the idea. And this one's just fun. I mean, what was God thinking? A square fish? Come on, God, a bad idea? What are the angels think? God, what are you doing here? Fish are supposed to be streamlined, aerodynamic. Well, this is a statement by Science Magazine, and it deals with what I'm about to talk about. They said this fish should swim about as well as a barn should fly. It's square, for goodness sakes. Why would it be square? Well, it's the creativity and the genius of the God who made it all. You know, oceanographers, scuba divers on coral reefs, they kind of noticed these stupid-looking little square fish. They actually seem to be able to maneuver as well or better than streamlined fish with the waves flowing back and forth on the coral reefs. They're not washed everywhere the waves go. They're just kind of fluttering their little fins and going wherever they want to go, very efficiently. So they started thinking, what else could we make like a square box? Have you noticed these stupid square cars that are running around today? What are the engineers thinking? Well, you got a lot of space that way, a lot of head space. And it turns out, here's a Daimler Chrysler concept car. They specifically, in every possible way, designed it like the box fish. And they admit that. And it turns out incredibly efficient. They found out in air tunnels, it has this reverse vortex flow that cancels out the drag effect you would expect to happen at the corners. Excellent maneuverability, 70 miles a gallon. I mean, it had a small motor, but still incredibly aerodynamically efficient because they looked at what God had made first. Starting to get the idea of all the things we can learn. A couple other fun things. How about construction? What does construction have to do with looking at what God has made? Turns out we started having world fairs back in 1851 was the very first, they called it the Great Exhibition. We're at the height of the Industrial Revolution. I mean, mankind is really starting to understand the scientific expansion, how things operate, how they work. Want to have a showcase of mankind's genius. So they asked the architects to design a building unlike any other building ever built as a showcase of mankind's genius. It wasn't the architects, it wasn't the engineers that won the design. It was a botanist who looked at God's design. And he came up with the concept of what he called the Crystal Palace. And it was literally designed like a giant lily pad. Here's a picture of a child sitting on the giant lily pad. Here's what it looks like underneath. It's supported, this little thin membrane can support a man or child because it's got these huge arteries with a bunch of little side beam supports. So he designed the Crystal Palace in London, England, 200,000 panes of glass, weighed millions of pounds. It was 10 stories high, 108 feet, covered 18 acres of ground. Phenomenal building, entirely from the outside of glass. The Crystal Palace, this is what it looked like. It was a sight to behold. The centerpiece of the World's Fair of that day. All of the experts, all the architects said, it can't possibly stand. Here's what it looked like on the inside. All the support structure based on the water lily. Predicted to collapse. It stood there for decades until there was a fire and the glass warped and it came down. But it had no problem at all because it was based on the design of God. Now here's another building based on the design of the human hip. Now, the engineer, his name was Gustav. It was designed in 1889. By the way, it was the tallest building on Earth in more than 4,000 years of human history. The Great Pyramid of Giza held the record for almost 4,000 years until 1889 when this building was built. And it was built for another World's Fair. It was 1,063 feet tall. The Great Pyramid's about 800 feet tall. Now you know the last name of the person who built it, the Eiffel Tower. And how did he build it? He looked at the human hip. The support for the human body is not straight down like all the skyscrapers of the day. It's thrown off to the side. It makes us more maneuverable. It allows us to have all the abilities we have as human beings. And he looked at that and he said, why not throw the support of a tall tower off to the side? Predicted by all the experts to collapse. Still standing there today. See, consensus thinking in any area, including science, is not necessarily right, because even scientists go with the pack, with consensus thinking, but it's not always, we don't know everything. Last subject is, what about space travel? Surely space travel has nothing to do with a bunch of biological creatures. Not so. You see, in order to survive in space, you've got to have energy, which means you've got to collect it from the sun, or you've got to send up nuclear power plants, which will still eventually run out, and you've got to keep resupplying with nuclear fuel. But the sun's a limitless source. A plant is, in essence, a solar energy regeneration collecting system that takes the sunlight, takes air, takes water, and turns it into the carbon, CO2, and the carbon structure of its body. So how do you get these thin, fragile solar collectors into space? You've got to pack them into a tightly well-protected space, and then they've got to unfold. So designers who designed the solar panels for the International Space Station, they looked at the biggest leaf they could find that unfolded into multiple structures, and it was the beech leaf. And they designed the solar panels and how they would unfold after they were launched based on the beech leaf. And I want to show you a little montage of the beech leaf as it's unfolding, because it is really cool.
Most people, when they think of origami, think, you know, my 8-year-old is doing origami. Why are these engineers at BYU working with origami? BYU's connection with origami began with the realization that origami was really a compliant mechanism. So a compliant mechanism is a device that gets its motion from things like bending and deflection instead of hinges and bearings. And we can actually make them very low cost sometimes. They can also operate in very harsh environments like the environment of space.
Origami helps inspire new ways of looking at how mechanisms can work or how we can approach solutions to problems.
It's very expensive, very difficult to get things into space. And the nice thing with a lot of origami is you can make it very compact for launch, and then as you get into space, you can deploy and be very large.
And we see flowers opening up exactly like that. We see leaves opening up exactly like that. That's where those concepts are coming from. Now, let me just get a few more slides, and then we're going to wrap up. So medical colleges, I mean, the medicines from plant origin, everything from malaria to infection drugs to penicillin to quinine, medicines from animals for arthritis and cancers and bacteria treatment and tumors and this is just a partial list. There are hundreds of them because of what God has made. Now the last one, Julie showed me this one, Julie Von Vett. She's the co-author of a lot of these devotionals, writes a phenomenal column called Have You Considered? This one just blew me away. And it's like, it's yet to be perfected. So this is just cutting edge stuff. You know, biologists noticed there's certain insects, and I think they were stunned, they just didn't seem to have a lot of bacteria growing on them. Now bacteria are everywhere. There are more bacteria in your body and on your body than there are cells. You're actually more bacteria than you are human. They're just everywhere. And 99% or more of them aren't harmful. There are actually many, you can't even survive without them. That's what's in your gut that helps digest everything. Well, there weren't very many bacteria on the cicada, okay? And they started to wonder why. Why aren't there many living bacteria on this cicada? And they realized its wings and its body are designed with these tiny little nano-sized, perfectly spaced and sized little spikes. And bacteria, when they land on them, they sag down and their cellular structure is disrupted. So they just die. Now, what Julie found this article was talking about was, imagine if we could make that structure and put it on doorknobs and doors and panels and hospitals and public places. You would no longer need disinfectant. The bacteria would just naturally die without chemicals. Isn't that just the coolest thing? Found the same thing on dragonflies, except theirs are shaped in various heights with little ridges that bend over, and the same sort of thing happened. The bacteria drops on it and sinks down, and it dies. It can't function. So there is something God has invented to incredibly benefit us, and we just have to go on to perfect it. And that's what I tell children. There's so many things yet to be discovered. Just look at what God has made. Let your imagination roam, and then start working on it. It took 14 years of effort to create Velcro, billion-dollar industry. Don't give up. There's things to be learned out there. Right back to this verse. Ask the beasts, they'll teach us. The birds of the heaven, they'll tell us things. Even the bushes of the earth will teach us. The fish of the sea, they'll declare things. And here's the kicker. Who among all of these does not know the hand of the Lord has done this? I'll tell you who. Every professor that's writing the textbooks in our universities. Now, they'll paraphrase this, but it's only foolishness to pretend there is no God. What does the world around us give credit for all of these inventions that have come from these things in the natural world? They give credit to evolution via mutations and natural selection. I was at SeaWorld about a year ago, and I went to the penguin show, and then I went to the dolphin show, and then with the whale show. Every single one of them, they know the word evolution may alienate some of the people. Every single script talked about adaptation. Did you know the penguins exist in in the Arctic because they've adapted to the cold? Take a pigeon and put it in Antarctica. See how well it adapts. You have a dead pigeon. It's not going to adapt. Unless the programming is there in its DNA, it's not going to survive. Won't happen. So the whole idea of adaptation. Do you know the dolphin has this incredibly muscular flute tail because its legs turned into that and it adapted to the ocean? It's right there in the script. It's storytelling. Now, could little changes, if they're useful, change one creature into another creature? That's where we want to end, and then I'm going to show a little clip from Dr. Sanford. He had in his book, it's one of these hallmark books of the whole creation movement called Genetic Entropy. I think one of the most acknowledged geneticists in the world, worked at Cornell University for his career. He invented what's called the gene gun, the ability to take DNA fragments from one plant nucleus, DNA, splice them into the nucleus gene of another plant in order to modify plant behavior. It's like cross-breeding, but you can pick the characteristics you want. He invented the process, used worldwide, widely acknowledged as that. He also realized everything is deteriorating downward. We never see new functional information being added. All of the examples of evolution are just loss of information that might be useful. And he realized it can't possibly be true. And he used the example I'm about to show you to help explain that. Now, I need my little red wagon. Okay, and then we're going to talk about genetic entropy. You see, when I was little, I had a little red wagon. I think a lot of us did. We had these little red wagons. We'd ride around on them. They were kind of fun. And as I got older, some of my friends, you know, they've got tricycles and then they get bicycles. And eventually you get older and you're a teenager and you have motorcycles. And eventually you get a car. But I was a dreamer. I just didn't want a motorcycle or a car. You know, I didn't even want a bigger wagon. That's me. What I really wanted, because I grew up in the 1960s, in the 1960s was all about Star Trek and Dr. Spock and Captain Kirk. What I really wanted was to ride around in the Starship Enterprise. Okay? Now, the difference between my little red wagon and the Starship Enterprise is like the difference between a bacteria and a human being. The amount of information that you'd have to add to a bacteria's DNA to end up with a human DNA is enormous. I mean, you gotta have warp drive engines and holodecks and transporter beams and photon torpedoes. I mean, it's just all this information. How is evolution gonna do that? All the textbooks say, well, mutations, random changes to the DNA. DNA is exactly like a book or a code, a computer code. And you got to randomly change it, just a letter or a word at a time. And maybe some of those changes might be useful. And if you do it over and over millions and billions of years, you're going to come up with something. And students will buy that, and they see examples of it. So don't assume there's not things that seem to make sense in the textbooks. Well, that is exactly like, I take my wagon, and underneath the wagon there's a book. Okay, this is the DNA code to build the wagon. To make the very next wagon, you have to take the information from the first wagon, rebuild the factory to produce the second wagon. That's what life does. Takes information from whether bacteria or a dog and makes the next bacteria or dog with that information. But every single time there are random changes, especially with more complex animals. Bacteria only has about 1 million letters in its DNA. You know, a mammal or a human, it has 3 billion letters, enormously amount. Well, every time you make a copy of a copy, it's like I go on this page, and let's say I just mark out 1 letter. That's a mutation. It's a permanent change to the book. I'll go over, say, 100 pages, and I'll take a word, and I'll move it to a different spot. I'll go over another 100 pages, and I'll just, I've already mutated that page. Let's say I'll change the A. I'll change the A to an E. So let's say I only made 1 change every 100 pages. There's 1,000 pages in the book. I just made 10 changes. Okay? 10 changes. Has anybody ever read a book and they've seen a misspelled word? Anybody? I love it when people participate. I don't think there's anybody who hasn't seen a mistake. Have you still been able to read and comprehend the book? Yeah, absolutely. So the second wagon, you build the factory with 10 mistakes in 1,000 pages, probably going to be fine. Wagon will be fine. One of those changes might even have been kind of useful. Like somehow maybe the word red got changed to, you know, maybe a couple changes got changed to blue just by random possibilities. So the blue wagon might sell really well. That's the kind of examples of a beneficial mutation. You know, we haven't increased the level of information. It's just been modified slightly, and it might be a useful change. Well, after 10 wagons, now you have a mistake on every 10 pages. After 100 wagons, you have a mistake on every single page. After 1,000 wagons, you have 10 mistakes on every page, random rearrangements of the letters. Now the wagons are going to start rolling off the assembly line, and maybe the wheels are going to fall off of one of them. The quality control department is natural selection. You know, that's the word that if it's useful, it can go on to be more wagons, it'll take over an environment. If it has problems, it'll go extinct. Well, guess what? The natural selection, the quality control department can't see the DNA. It can't change the changes. It can't understand the code. It's just, well, the wagon looks the right size, off it goes to market to see how well it'll sell. That's natural selection in the natural world. So if the wheel falls off, it can eliminate that wagon, but 10 other wagons are going to go past it with little changes that are going to build up and build up and build up. Is that process of randomly changing a letter here and there going to change a wagon into the Starship Enterprise? No, it will never happen. If you did nothing else but explain to students what natural selection can do and what it can't do, I think the vast majority of the students would never believe in evolution, but it never gets explained to them. It's deteriorating things downward, those mutations, and natural selection can't stop it because it can't see the little tiny point changes. 99.99% of them are imperceptible, but ultimately it will reduce the genetic code to gobbledygook, where nothing will work. And it's happening so fast. You understand what God has told us, just in a very clear way? The original humanity, Adam and Eve and his sons and their sons, they lived 700, 800, 900 years because the copies weren't filled with mistakes. But by the time of the flood, you're down to 600 and 700 years. After the flood, they're living 300 and 400 years. By the time of Abraham, they're living 200 years. By the time of Moses, the life of man, the King David, is 70, maybe 80 years. Because mistake is added to mistake is added to mistake and builds up over generations. And that's just in 3,000 years of human history. Nothing could survive this for millions of years. Life is not millions of years old on this planet. It's one of those enormous evidences that we can know God is creator. Now I want to end, just want to take 5 minutes. I want to show you just one little short segment from The Rocks Cry Out. I spent the last 3 years, I haven't been here for 2 years, filming what I thought would be the best creation curriculum I could possibly come up with. I didn't want to just be me lecturing. I wanted to be out in the field in the Grand Canyon, at Mount St. Helens, at the Paluxy River, in science museums, filled with animation, filled with video clips. And I interviewed some of the world's top experts, including Dr. Sanford. In this video, he's talking about the DNA, could it transform from an ape to a human? And he just gives one example of how it could never happen. I want to end with his words, because I think it's the best possible ending to understand, why are we gathered here? Why are we learning all this cool stuff about creation? What good is it anyway? And he has such a quiet, authoritative way of teaching. I want him to have the final words in this lecture. So kind of watch this little segment of what these lessons, these Rocks Cry Out lessons are like. And then think about putting it into use in your church. It's a phenomenal small group Sunday school class, because it's not just about Christian living and Christian theology. It's about history and reality and science and the Bible and why it's so authoritative. But here's Dr. Sanford, kind of wrapping us up tonight.
4 powerful arguments that actually disprove evolution have come to light in the last decade. And that's like, these arguments are incredibly strong. First one is programming of life. So I'd like to read a quote here from Bill Gates, who knows a little bit about computers, right? And so he says this: the understanding of life is a great subject. Biological information is the most important information we can discover, because over the next several decades it will revolutionize medicine. Human DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created. And in other words, the information system, just the information system within the DNA, is more sophisticated than our best computer scientists can program. Way beyond what they could ever accomplish. Oftentimes when people try to teach the idea of ape to man evolution, they use like an illustration, and so you just reshape a chimp into a human. But you see, what makes a human is the information. The human who has the genetic information necessary for doing calculus and sending men to the moon and for doing art. They're programmed to be humans and to have human bodies, and that information is in the DNA. And chimpanzees are programmed to be chimpanzees and to behave like chimpanzees. They're really good at climbing trees, and they're really good at peeling bananas, for example. So this programming, it requires reprogramming. Now, one thing that computer scientists really, really understand really, really clearly is that programs don't arise by themselves. And you can't just trial and error try to improve a program. Well, let's just change a bit here and a bit there and a byte there, and maybe it'll morph into a totally new functional program. That's not how computer science works, and that's not how any information system works. Information is the product of intelligence. And so the information within a cell is staggering. I can't adequately explain it, except to say that the DNA is just the first level of the information. Here's a concept that I think everyone can grasp, is everything in the cell is talking to everything else. So there's crosstalk within all the components of a cell and between all the cells of a body. There's crosstalk continuously. It's similar to an internet system within a cell. And then we have 100 trillion cells in our body, and there's an internet that lets them talk to each other as well. It's staggering. Information is staggering. It makes information technology look puny. And so people, as we look at life and the way it's programmed, we should be in awe. How would you go about designing the human consciousness? Or creating musical genius? Or which nucleotides would you have to change to create those things? And so these things go beyond our comprehension. But God did it, and it's wonderful. And we are fearfully and wonderfully made. And more God is showing that through biology, through the highest level of molecular biology. He's revealing that to us. It's an amazing gift from God. And then he's given us these 4 powerful arguments that are just dynamite. Hallelujah. Is the conversation over? No. What proof could we provide to show that human evolution is false that would make the world change its mind? There is no argument. The world has set its mind on this belief system, and it's not a matter of just science. It's primarily a matter of ideology. And so this isn't going to go away. One of the things that I've been asked, and it's coming from an atheist who's, he was being a little bit sarcastic. He's saying, so why did God make the apes? Was he just trying to make it look like we evolved from the lower life form? And I thought about that. I thought, God, it would have been a lot easier for me if you hadn't made the apes, because no one's going to believe that we came from dogs or horses or anything else. But I'd like to suggest that there's another type of design on a level that we haven't normally talked about, and that is what I call intelligently designed ambiguity. God could eliminate all the ambiguity. He could just show up, right? He will someday, but he doesn't. He tests our faith. And so he allows ambiguity. The evolutionists will always have arguments. And so people who are waiting to accept the Lord because evolution's been absolutely disproven, they're going to have a long wait. There will always be arguments. And so it becomes a matter of, do you trust the Lord or do you trust man? I've spent 18 years of my life looking at apologetics and defending from a genetic point of view Scripture and showing that the evolutionary paradigm, which I used to believe, that it's not viable. But all that is just to encourage believers to believe. But in heaven, when we meet the other believers, most of them will have never heard of Charles Darwin or the waiting time problem. They will have read and believed Scripture and trusted the Lord. And that trumps everything. So the reason for these types of scientific arguments is simply to remove barriers to faith.
And I just thought that that's a perfect way to end this. We're here to remove the barriers to faith of the world around us. And the education system and the media and the movies and the internet, it has built a mountain of perception that God's word can't be trusted. But it can. It means what it says, and the evidence is there to support it. And that's the point of the resources, to go around people's blindness and put the truth in front of them and help wake them, help the Lord, be part of what the Lord's doing to wake them up. And I'm seeing that in Fiji where that mountain doesn't exist yet. And we're building a mountain of truth to resist the evolution lies as they come in. And their textbooks are starting to be filled with those lies. And they're not being bought yet. They haven't accepted them yet, but they don't know what to do with them. And we're showing them that it's a misinterpretation. It's a misunderstanding of what God has done. And here's the other evidence you're not seeing. So I'd encourage you to do that. I mean, the video series is very, very well done, as you saw. And it can change the perception in churches of dozens, if not hundreds of people, if it's shown. So put them to use in that way. And the same with the books. So thank you so much. Any thoughts or comments or questions about anything I was talking about? What's going on overseas or the kind of stuff we talked about in nature? Yes?
Where do you get all your information? You know, you got pages and pages of animals and bugs.
Well, there's a lot of really good creation organizations. Oh, which reminds me, I really want to mention this one other thing. Answers in Genesis, the Creation Ministries International, the Institute for Creation Research, they all put out monthly magazines. A lot of the ideas come from that. Over the last 3 decades, there have been hundreds of books written on the evidence for creation. And I know both Julie and I, Julie's a homeschool teacher of hundreds of students all over Minnesota, science teacher. And she just looks for things to wake the students up and help them to see the truth. And we gather them. I mean, if I find something interesting that I didn't know before, I think, well, I'm probably not the only one who didn't know this. And that's what those devotionals do. They take interesting little things that God has done, or pieces of the creation model. How does the flood explain fossil records and where dinosaurs fit in and where the ice age and the cultures fit in, and condense them into little one-page articles of a few paragraphs, and then tie in Bible verses that show it's all one reality. So we just read a lot. And by the way, one of the speakers who came with us, Jason Browning, he started the New Jersey Creation Organization, has come with us to Fiji 3 times. He spent the last year setting up creation101.org. There's a bunch of stickers over there. Whenever we give these books out in the other countries, we've been sticking this on there because then they can, on their cell phones, they can go and read the same pages. He took time, like if it talks about one of some animal or some bird, he would go to the creation organizations, find some technical paper about that same subject, and they'll read the article on their phone, and then they can link to it and immediately go to more information, more technical, deep information, or videos. So that's available to everybody, creation101.org, and there's a bunch of stickers back there. Grab one on your way out. So it's just a neat other resource. Okay, so we read a lot. That's where our ideas come from. Other questions?
Is there a license requirement for showing the rocks cry out in church?
No, nor is there a license requirement for making copies and giving them out to others. Now, I spent $150,000 filming these because I wanted them to be really, really high quality with animation, drone footage filmed on site. And I'll probably never recover it, but that's why I sell them. But I also put them on my website, and the Rocks Cry Out episodes rotate through on a 3-month basis. There's every week one of them disappears and a new one appears. So people can put them to use. So Julie and I both, when we give away books, we don't take any royalty or any commission. When we sell them, we take like about $1, and then the ministry gets $1, and we sell them for, typically 3 for $25 for a beautiful hardcover book, or even lower, so that you can afford to give them away. Because that's the point, is to get the truth out there. So I've just always felt it's not my job to hold back everything I do in order to protect it, but rather to freely make it available for people to put to use. And the only reason we charge at all is so we can afford to print books to give away. So, other questions? There was someone over here that had a question. Yes?
Just a simple question, but not simple for me.
Yeah.
How do you, like when you go through all these things and a massive amount of information, how do you categorize it so that you can remember it? Like my memory is...
Oh my goodness, I don't. I forget 90% of what I read and do. Organization's huge. I mean, I have a file. When I read something and it's interesting, I'll stick it in a file it'll come back to later, and the books are set up. By the way, at the back there's a glossary, and if you're interested in geology, you can go to all the geology pages. If you're interested in genetics, you can go to all the genetics pages. So just by being organized, I think, is the best way to remember. So.
Where do you find more good resources on this biomimicry topic?
Most of these came from a book by Donald DeYoung called, do you remember the name of Donald DeYoung's book? creation design, something like that. But if you look up Donald DeYoung on Amazon, you'll see his book, and it has 100 of these kind of examples. And then they're referenced to other examples. So that's a good starting point. So, yeah.
Can you explain the theory of thermodynamics and who discovered it?
It may have, I mean, the first law of thermodynamics is that matter and energy can never be created or destroyed. I don't even know who the founder of that is, but that's the most tested law of science, that matter can't make itself. And yet the Big Bang says everything came from nothing. So it violates what we know about science. The second one, and I could be wrong, but I was thinking it was Isaac Newton that formalized that entropy always increases, that things always move toward a state of more disorder, that the usable energy is always, there's a net loss whenever any physical reaction or interaction happens. There's always a loss of friction, there's always a loss of heat. So everything's winding down, everything's deteriorating, everything's becoming less complex, not more complex, unless you use intelligence and control the energy input. The easiest way to visualize that law of thermodynamics, this building exists not because there were a bunch of wood and plaster and wires and pipes and a dynamite exploded and turned it into a building. The law of science says those stacks of materials will get more disorderly when you just add energy. And it's true every time we observe it. Albert Einstein said the second law of thermodynamics is the most important foundational law of all science, because we never see an exception to it. So why does the building exist? Because intelligent people with a plan control the energy input. And then you can get in complexity to increase in a little local area. But just random sunlight coming to Earth could never create more order. And that's what evolution pretends has happened. So I hope that helped. Yeah. Just about every observation we make says, yeah, the universe does seem to be expanding. Well, entropy says that heat's going to move from hot to cold, and eventually everything's going to become the same temperature throughout the universe, and yet the universe is filled with hot objects. That means it had to have had a beginning, and it can't be infinitely old, both of which point to God. And furthermore, the Bible says God rolled out the heavens like a scroll. It stretched out the heavens like a curtain. So we're probably seeing the residual effect of what God said he did. So none of these observations violate in any way what the Bible tells us. It's just we leave God out and we assume it all made itself. But none of it works because nothing can become nothing. So that doesn't work. So there had to be something that made everything, which is God. And it can't be eternal or it would all be the same temperature. So that doesn't work. So obviously the laws of science point to the fact that God was creator, and he told us he stretched things out as he was making the universe. I don't think so. I think the past tense is the statements in Genesis are past tense. It says God made the stars also, past tense. We've never seen a new star form. And gas always expands outward. Gravity is too weak to pull gas together. That's another law of science. So we observe these things and we know it's something that was done in the past we don't see happening today. Same with life. We don't see chemicals coming together to make life. And we see lots of variety built into the DNA code. So you get lots of kinds of dogs. Is that creating something new? No, it's the sorting out of information that was created to begin with. So it depends on how you define create, something new.
Maybe one more.
Yeah, one last question. Yes?
That original video of that fish, is that easy to find?
Yeah, I can give you the 3 videos that I use, so you have them. Actually, if you go to YouTube, that's where you find videos, is on YouTube. You Google Japanese puffer fish, that video will pop up. Okay? Yes, okay. Thank you.